he's going to carry out the transformations that would make permanent revolution a reality in countries like Egypt and Tunisia.
The title of this meeting is really focused on Gamal Abdel Nasser and the failure of Arab nationalism. But as I'll come on to explain, what I actually want to do first is to look at the role of Nasser and the Free Officers movement in the Egyptian revolution and the revolution crisis in Egypt in the 1940s and early 1950s, because what I want to argue is that although it's very common to see Nasser as the kind of spokesperson, the leader, the most emblematic figure of the Arab Revolution of the 1950s, which I would say yes he is, I would argue that actually the roots of that position that he holds and his ability to play that particularly emblematic and important role as a symbol of resistance to imperialism, of being the person who was the kind of figurehead for shutting the Suez Canal and resisting British and French and Israeli attempts to attack Egypt in 1956. He became the spokesperson for anti-imperialist rejection of the state of Israel and resistance to resistance to Zionism in the 1960s. That all of that role was predicated on the revolutionary crisis that began in the 1940s, and that really what Nasser represented was a deflection of that process of revolution into a new form, which meant that ultimately the hopes that were raised and the struggles that took place in the 1940s and 1950s, and the hopes that Nasser himself raised and contributed to in terms of the possibility of resisting imperialism and building a society in the Middle East that was based on social justice, were ultimately defeated because of the process that the revolutions went through in the 1940s and early 1950s, and crucially because what Nasser represented was a small part of the middle class, in this case really the army officers, but actually representative of a wider layer of lower middle class intellectuals and so on, seized control of the state to use it as a vehicle for national development and for building a kind of stronger state, which they believed could both stand up to imperialism and provide an alternative of a more just, a more socially just society within Egypt. But at the same time, in order to achieve that, they felt that they had to demobilise the popular movement from below, that they had to destroy the capacity of, particularly of the working class, to organise itself independently of the state and to bring that under the leadership of the state, and that was the fundamental reason why the other parts of Nasser's struggle ended up being defeated, that on the level of both anti-imperialism and at the level of social justice, ultimately Nasserism ended up being a failure. And the failure of Nasserism in this respect is something that had very, very deep consequences that we're still now seeing even today. So what I want to start with first is something that I talked about in the meeting I did on permanent revolution a few days ago, which is the kind of interconnection of three processes of struggle, or in a sense, three aspects of the same struggle, the same class struggle, where in the moments of revolutionary crisis, as I'll argue took place in the 1940s in the Middle East, you have interconnecting struggles over political questions, the question of political democracy in particular, the expansion of democratic and popular control over the state. You also have, interconnecting with that, very deep struggles for social justice against rising food prices, against the cost of living going up, struggles generally in this period, as we're seeing today, led by organised workers through independent trade unions and radical left parties, against poverty in the countryside as well, connecting with the struggles of peasants and the wider struggles of the urban poor. And a third aspect of the struggle, which was the struggle against imperialism, which in the 1940s, as today, connected intimately with both of these other aspects of the struggle. A very simple level, the question of imperialism was not something that was simply related to the presence of foreign troops on the soil of many Arab countries, although that was absolutely a crucial part and a crucial motor of struggle in both Egypt and many other countries, particularly in Egypt, actually, because immediately after the Second World War, Egypt had tens of thousands of British troops in what appeared to be a permanent occupation of the country. Obviously, it had been a huge military base for the Allies during the Second World War, and the Suez Canal had been a crucial waterway, and even some of the crucial battles of the North Africa campaign fought in the desert near Alexandria, where Rommel's advance was stopped in a battle there. So Egypt was under direct British military occupation, and in fact at the end of the Second World War showed absolutely no sign of reducing much of that military occupation until a mass popular movement arose to fight that. However, but even more than that, imperialism was also part of the fabric of the economy through the intervention through foreign companies, foreign-owned capitalists, enterprises, which brought, for example, many of the public utilities, and this was true across most of the Middle East, many of the public utilities companies were, as they are today, through the process of neoliberal globalisation, actually owned by British or French corporations. So this is true in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt. So the electric light company, for example, would be owned by a British or French company. The Tramways Corporation would be owned by, again, a British or French company. So, in fact, as Tony Cliff noted at the time in his book on the problem of the Middle East, Cliff was at that point living in Palestine up until 1946, a Jewish Palestinian socialist Trotskyist, analysing what was going on in the Middle East, and he pointed out that, of course, when workers moved into struggle against their bosses were also part of imperialism, and it wasn't simply the case, of course, that these companies had somehow come in with a kind of level playing field and were competing with companies run by Egyptians or Iraqis, or representatives of an Egyptian or an Iraqi bourgeoisie. They came in with the support of the political dimension of imperialism, which was the regimes of the era, which were very directly client states of British and French imperialism across the Middle East. In the case of Britain and Iraq, the level to which the monarchies were satellites of the British Empire was even more direct and even more obvious than in many ways than you could argue that some of the current regimes are satellites of American imperialism. So, for example, at the level of the repressive apparatus of the state across the Middle East, in the British Britain's so-called informal empire in the Middle East, even down to the district level of police officers, many of those were British, and certainly at the level of police commissioners and so on, throughout the region, the British played a direct role in running the police, and at the level of within the ministries as well. Again, common across Egypt and Iraq, you'd find advisors from Britain playing a central role behind the scenes. And of course, this was all part of an architecture of treaties and direct links, making Egypt, Iraq subservient to British interests at a formal level. One of these things was expressed, which is this is an important point in terms of the development of Nasser's movement itself, of the Free Officers movement, was expressed in the weakness and dependency of the Egyptian and Iraqi armies in particular on Britain, so that while you had a situation of huge numbers of British troops in Egypt, you had a very small Egyptian army which only started to build up a native Egyptian officer class in the 1930s. Prior to that, as a result of Egypt being part of the Ottoman Empire, many of the officers had been from the Turkish elite that had governed the country under the Ottoman Empire. So Nasser was of the very first generation of Arab Egyptian officers who went into the army and found themselves within an institution that was under British military leadership, that had very few military resources of its own, and could really feel the subservient role of the Egyptian state vis-a-vis imperialism. So, at all of these levels, you see all of these aspects of the same struggle interconnecting. And what I think is the crucial point here is that from after the Second World War, really, although many of these struggles have their roots in the struggles during the Second World War, across the region, there was a wave of struggles and protests leading to moments of real insurrectionary crisis and revolutionary crisis across many of the countries of the region, which looks very similar in many ways to what we're seeing today. In fact, strikingly similar. Although, as I'll come on perhaps at the end, the crisis in many ways is deeper, and the movement has gone further to some extent already than what was achieved in the 1940s. So, just as an example, in the case of Egypt, 1945. The war ends and opens very quickly a period of massive workers' struggles. In late 1945, the textile industry, huge strikes across particularly the textile workers in the north of Cairo. Early 1946, the students march demanding British evacuation. The British troops should be taken out of Egypt. As they march across the Abbas Bridge in central Cairo, they're attacked by the police and the British Army, and a number of them are killed. Horrific scenes of students being forced to jump into the river, streaming with blood. And this becomes the trigger for an absolutely enormous general strike, protest, and so on. And interestingly, in forms of organisation bringing together workers, representatives, activists from building the independent unions in the textile sector and across large parts of the Egyptian economy in an organisation called the National Committee of Workers and Students, where the student struggle and the workers' struggle fused to build a kind of coordinating body which called for, on the 1st of February 1946, a huge protest. It was called the Day of Evacuation. And there's some fantastic reports actually of what it was like, which again echo the kind of things that people talk about in terms of what was in Tahrir and in the height of the uprisings in recent months. The soldiers were sent to patrol the streets and being hailed by the people and hailed as part of the revolutionary movement. Of Sudanese students being carried on the shoulders of the crowd with people shouting unity of Egypt and the Sudan, unity and struggle against the British Crown. Many slogans of unity between Muslims and Christians. Being shouted out, and a huge presence of workers in the heart of it. Now that movement opened up a period of several years of peaks and troughs of both intersecting struggle over social justice, over the kind of track of economic struggle, driven by rising unemployment, rising food prices, and also by the rising confidence of these newly formed independent trade unions, alongside a continuing to grow, again with ups and downs. There was a huge crackdown in 1946 which ended up smashing up the National Committee of Workers and Students, and there was a wave of arrests and so on. So I mean, it was never simply onwards and upwards, but a kind of peaks and troughs of struggle. The next key moment in Egypt actually came in 1948, when again there was a wave of strikes and protests in the early part of 1948, feeding into rising levels of struggle around Palestine, because this intersects, of course, with the moment when the partition plan of Palestine was accepted by the United Nations in late 1947. The war in Palestine is beginning with Palestinians beginning to confront and fight directly with the Zionist militias, who are starting to implement the plan to seize Palestine and set up a Zionist state. And this feeds into the struggle in Egypt directly. One of the high points really comes in April 1948, with a police strike, where the police in Egypt, who were start raising, firstly actually it's against the economic struggle, they are raising issues about their own pay and conditions. And you have these extraordinary scenes in Cairo and Alexandria, where you have policemen marching through the streets in their tens of thousands with loaves of bread on their truncheons, waving them and demanding the right to form unions and to be part of the national struggle and to be paid better. Confronting the army, which has been brought in to keep order. And there was a siege of the police club, where you had the police in the police club, protected by rings of demonstrators, of people from the national movement, from the popular mobilisation, and then the army on the outside with their guns pointed inwards, which is really quite an extraordinary example of the deep crisis of the Egyptian state at that period. Simultaneously with this, in Iraq, you actually had a popular insurrection known as the Wathba, took place in January 1948. And in this case, the struggle really was lit at the level of anti-imperialism and was triggered by the decision of the Iraqi government to renegotiate the treaty of alliance that they had with Britain. And as I said before, this kind of treaty of alliance was a treaty that was about keeping Iraq obviously subservient to British interests. And was seen by many Iraqis as an absolute insult to the country. When it was announced by the Prime Minister that a new treaty had been signed, which would perpetuate and extend this relationship, this subservient relationship with Britain, mass strikes and protests exploded across Iraq, leading to a near insurrectionary situation where forcing the regent, Abdullah, who was ruling in place of the young king, who was still a child, sacked the Prime Minister and cancelled the treaty. So again, massive popular uprising from below forces the Iraqi state to cancel this newly signed agreement with Britain. And that opened the door to, again, a wave of strikes and protests and workers' organisation going on for several months afterwards. And both of these examples are important because I think they give a sense of the scale of the crisis, and that this is the backdrop for the development of the officers' organisation. Because, of course, as you know, the end of the story is not, sadly, that Tony Cliff's hopes from 1945 were realised in terms of the socialist revolution in late 1940s, 1950s Egypt, but actually in the seizure of power by army officers, small groups of army officers. So how does that fit in? As I mentioned before, the army officers around Nasser and his generation, which we're talking about a relatively small group of people, many of whom were personal friends with each other, fit into this picture in several ways. Firstly, within the institution of the army, as I said, there are these sharp tensions and contradictions in terms of the role of the army in relation to British imperialism, which they feel really, really acutely. If you can imagine being a young officer going through the army training, all these ideas pumped into your head about the glory and honour of the nation and so on. But you see that the general, your general, the Egyptian general, completely under the thumb of the British officers. That you see that there's no, it's just, that the army itself is a sham and a fake. It has practically no weapons. It can do nothing. And whereas the British army is there occupying your country. So you can imagine the kind of contradictions. And for some of the officers of Nasser's generation, although not actually him particularly, which becomes quite important, they were also brought directly into this position of having to police the struggle itself. As I mentioned, the army was brought into the streets in 1946, 1948, at the moments of crisis to police the streets. I interviewed one of the left-wing free officers, a guy called Ahmed Hamrouche, who was an officer who remembered in 1946, at the time of the Evacuation Day protests, he said, we held a meeting among the officers, and they were thus on the left and the Muslim Brotherhood sympathisers among the officers, and we said, if the order comes to fire, we won't do it. And you can see how this process of protest on the street starts to feed into what the officers are thinking as well. And at the level of the question of social justice, it becomes more complicated. Nasser and his colleagues, by becoming officers, were at a middle class layer in society. They actually did have a much higher standard of living than the vast majority of Egyptians. They could afford, small things like. They could afford to have a house of their own, a small car, to go to the cinema, to buy a fridge. This is completely beyond the wildest dreams of textile workers, for example, in Shubra. And so this class position did affect very much the worldview of people like Nasser. Nasser himself was There's a great story about Khalid Mohiuddin, who is one of the left-wing free officers as well, and who was actually within the kind of inner core of the free officers. And he was the only one really of that inner core who had close relationships with the radical left. He had a close relationship with one of the communist movements. And he remembered one time that he took Nasser to meet a guy called Comrade Badr, who became the general secretary of one of the communist movements in Egypt. And alongside another leading communist activist who happened to be a lawyer. And they sat together and they discussed, and Nasser was really impressed. He was very impressed with Badr, he was very impressed with the other guy. And they'd had a long, deep conversation. And then afterwards, Nasser turned around to Khalid Mohiuddin and asked about their jobs. And Khalid Mohiuddin said, well, such and such is a lawyer, and Badr, he's a mechanic, which he's an Air Force mechanic. He worked for the British Air Force as a mechanic. And at that moment, Nasser's attitude completely changed. He didn't want to listen, despite the fact he'd been impressed by the conversation. He forgot about this because he didn't want to be seen to be listening to a mechanic. And Khalid Mohiuddin said that whenever Nasser wanted to score points against him in a meeting, he'd say, don't listen to him, his leader's a mechanic. Which, at level of an anecdote, is actually very revealing about the contradictions within this. On the other hand, though, these officers are not part of the old elite. They're not part of the people who had the most wealth in society. They also felt very much excluded from the political and social elite. So in that sense, they genuinely were in the middle and pulled both ways. And another key element in the development of the officers, both organisation and their political ideas, is of course what happens in Palestine. It's absolutely crucial in understanding what pushes them to the position that they find themselves in 1952. And most of the reports, if you read some of the biographies of the officers, then they kind of tend to give an impression of organisation going back for, sort of 10, 15 years before the revolution, which is not very likely to be true. Most of the evidence suggests that even the very rudiments of any kind of organisation among the free officers in the Egyptian army, it post-dates 1948 and certainly post-dates their experience of what happened in Palestine. But what happened in Palestine is absolutely crucial for a couple of reasons. You have this immense crisis taking place on the borders with Egypt. The Nakba, is in full swing. Refugees pouring into the Gaza Strip, pouring out into the West Bank. Huge mobilisation, popular mobilisation in Egypt, demanding that the Egyptian government intervene and help save the Palestinians and support their struggle. And of course, the Egyptian elite absolutely tied up with British imperialism, and it's Britain that is running the mandate in Palestine, running the Palestinian mandate. So the Egyptian government, until the very last minute, is absolutely determined not to send any kind of military support, or certainly any formal military support, if it can possibly avoid it, because this would be in conflict with its British masters. So, although through the Arab League there were a number of volunteer sort of military formations went in, and some people close to the officers took part in this, Nasser himself is mobilised to go and fight in Egypt as part of, after the end of the mandate in May 1948. The Egyptian army goes into Palestine and is absolutely defeated. And this had a cataclysmic effect on people like Nasser. There's a recounted later, again this is in Khalid Mohiuddin's memoirs, of the core of them sitting around in Nasser's drawing room, and Nasser saying, this is after the defeat of the army by the Zionists. He says, a bunch of Zionist irregulars, they defeated our army. How on earth can we now allow this to happen? How on earth can we? Now we have to organise to get rid of the people at home who are preventing us from supporting the Palestinians, who have tied us to imperialism in this way. And so the experience of defeat in Palestine is absolutely crucial, radicalising moment in the development of the Free Officers. The question then of where the struggle goes becomes very important. The final crisis of the old Egyptian regime really starts in late 1951, early 1952, and again you see the intersection of the struggles on the social plane and on the anti-imperialism and political democracy. There's a huge wave of both strikes and protests over the cost of living in late 1951, intersecting with a huge popular mobilisation against the British, where essentially the British lose control of the Canal Zone. By this period, British troops have moved out from the main cities in Egypt to the Suez Canal Zone itself, where they're confronted with themselves simultaneously with a guerrilla uprising, which is actually very costly to them. Relatively large numbers of British troops are killed by guerrilla forces, some of whom from the Muslim Brotherhood, some of whom for other kind of political groups, and so on. At the same time, there's huge popular protests in all the main urban areas in Egypt. One of the biggest demonstrations actually in Egyptian history before this year took place in November 1951, where between 500,000 and 1 million Egyptians marched in Cairo, and around 250,000 in Alexandria, and tens of thousands in other cities, which Egypt's population was 18 to 20 million at the time. So in relative terms, actually it's a fairly similar level of mobilisation. The crucial point, though, here is that the kind of peak of this struggle, which is the 26th of January 1952, when there were a massacre of Egyptian police by the British in the Canal Zone on the 25th, triggers an uprising in Cairo on the 26th. It didn't actually break the state, or it didn't break the top of the state. The regime limped on. Farouk, the king, the Mubarak of the era, sacked the government, but was able to hold on to power. And it's only 6 months later that the Free Officers then launch a military coup, which allows them to remove Farouk, and they install themselves essentially as a kind of transitional regime. Now, in the remaining time that I've got, I want to just talk through some of the consequences of the consolidation of the Free Officers' rule in Egypt, and what that meant for these three interlinking struggles. That although it's important to say that just because the free officers took power in July 1952, that it was not a done deal that they would manage to maintain their rule, or that they even themselves had a clear idea of what they wanted to, that they had themselves a clear idea that they were going to stay in power, and they had some kind of clear programme of what they were going to do. They were a very mixed bag in terms of politics. I mentioned Khalid Mohiuddin, who's very influenced by the communists. Nasser himself pulled in a number of different directions. They had also members who were very close to the Muslim Brotherhood. So they were a very heterogeneous group of people politically. But over the next few years, they do manage to consolidate themselves. And Nasser himself emerges, again, from being a kind of first among equals. He was a leading figure in the free officers before the revolution itself, or before the seizing power in 52, but he emerges as the pivotal figure. And there's an internal struggle between him and Mohammed Naguib, who's the general who they get to kind of front up the coup in 52. And that they're able to start the process of building of changing the way that the Egyptian state functions, and in particular over the following kind of 10 years, move first gradually and then more quickly in the direction of two sorts of important policies, which, as you'll see, link very directly to these three aspects of the struggle I was talking about. At the level of the internal level of the economy and the kind of development of the country, again, fairly slowly at first, but then by the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, accelerating, Nasser takes Egypt down a path of state capitalist development, essentially, modelled on the experience of the Soviet Union, using the state as a way to break the blockage, the internal blockage caused by the domination of the elites that were linked very closely to imperialism, particularly included the large landowners. One of the first things that the free officers do is actually they force through a land reform, which is about breaking the political power of some of these, and to a certain extent the economic power of some of these large landowners, and freeing up land ownership, giving land to some of the small farmers. But they also, by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, you're talking about building state-run industry, heavy industry, including manufacturing, iron and steel production, the Aswan Dam, in order to get hydroelectric power for industrialisation, nationalisation of the banks, creating using the power of the state to do this, and as a mechanism to redistribute some of the fruits of that development to ordinary people. And this is very important because you get this kind of Faustian pact, in a sense, where what's on offer to the Egyptian masses, to the Egyptian workers in particular, is a system that does give people better job security than they had before. It redistributes wealth to them through forms of social welfare. There's building up an education system, building up a health system, and so on. These are all real and concrete gains, and better than what people had in previous years. But the quid pro quo was that they had to give up. They were forced to give up any kind of possibility of independent political organisation, independent organisation per se. The trade unions, for example, the independent unions that had played such an important role in the struggles of the 1940s, were then broken and subsumed by the state, and a new state-run federation was created in 1957, which was run from the top by the government. On the level of anti-imperialism, again, which connects to both of these struggles, Nasser does play a pivotal role, one actually driven by the need to embark on this programme of national development. One of the key kind of process involved is that his confrontation with British imperialism, French imperialism at Suez, was motivated by the need to find money to build the Aswan Dam, which was why he decided to go for the nationalisation of the Suez Canal, because he'd been refused by the World Bank a loan to do this. Well, he'd been refused by the World Bank to the loan because he'd got arms from the Czechs, effectively from the Soviet Union, in order to build up Egypt's capability to resist Israel, because the Israelis had been one of the motivating factors in the Czech arms deal was the Israeli incursions and raids on Gaza, where the Egyptian army was confronting directly with the new Zionist state. So you can see at this level again the interaction between these struggles, and Nasser comes to play in the region a very, very important role as somebody who would stand up to imperialism. The Suez Canal, the nationalisation of the Suez Canal is, although it is an absolutely magnificent example of resistance to imperialism, and I always say this to comrades from Egypt and colleagues from Egypt, are very proud that actually in Britain there was also a big anti-war movement, and there was even strike action opposing the aggression on Egypt. And Trafalgar Square was full of people protesting in solidarity with the Egyptians as they were being attacked by the British, the French, and the Israelis. But there's a sting in the tail of all this, because although, despite these achievements, and despite at its height Arab nationalism in the form that Nasser projected it, appearing to be a real and genuine alternative to imperialism, and to offer some kind of social justice and a better system for ordinary Egyptians. Ultimately, it failed on both counts. On the level of anti-imperialism, the key moment really came in 1967 with the defeat inflicted by the Israelis against Egypt and the other Arab countries in the Six Day War, which was at a psychological level as well as a military level an absolutely crushing blow for the hopes that people had that it was possible to resist imperialism in the region. I'm not going to go into the details of the Six Day War itself, but within hours of the Israeli mobilisation starting, almost the entirety of the Egyptian Air Force had been wiped out on the runways by Israeli bombing raids. The Israelis ended up in occupation of Gaza. They took the West Bank. They took the Golan Heights. They defeated the Jordanians, defeated the Syrians, seized the Sinai Desert, so were entrenched on the east bank of the Suez Canal. And it was an absolutely pivotal moment of crisis for Nasser. And you have to ask yourself, actually, why is it that the Israelis didn't push on further? Why did they not go to Cairo? Maybe they could have, overthrown Nasser, installed a more pliant regime. I think I would argue that the reason that they didn't is because there was again still an echo of the mass mobilisation from below, that people started organising themselves, that they knew that echo of the movement of the 1940s, which had defeated militarily, actually had defeated the British around the battle for the canal, was still there and still alive. That Egyptians would have resisted at a popular level, even if the leadership of their army had been unable to stand up to Zionism effectively. There's a very important lesson there, that it was actually the resilience and the strength of the popular movement from below that was unquenchable and undefeated in 1967, not the generals and the conventional armies, which were decisively defeated. And tragically, there was also, therefore, which led into it, a defeat at the social level, that Nasser was essentially broken by 1967. He died in 1970 and was replaced by Anwar Sadat, who turned Egypt towards a path of accommodation with the West, both in terms of signing up to the Camp David agreement with Israel by the end of the decade, but also crucially towards a policy of neoliberal reform, of undoing the social gains that the Nasserist state had brought in, and opening the era of neoliberal reform, which has brought us to where we are. I want to end really on that point, in that I think the lessons of the experience of the three officers and the Nasserist era are extremely important today, because they show that you cannot, if the revolutionary process that we see unfolding is deflected on any of these levels of struggle, that without the independent organisation from below, that resistance to imperialism and the creation of a society that is more socially just is not something that can be achieved. It's only on all those three levels, all those three aspects of the struggle combined, that we can see both the strength and the resilience to stand up to imperialism, to build a more democratic society, and to organise for a society of social justice. And that is what the potential is there today. Thank you.